All right, welcome. With me today is Tom Rieman. He is CEO and founding partner of Practice Intel, a growth platform for financial professionals to give great advice experience. Tom, welcome.
Hey, Jeff, thanks so much for having me today.
So I know we're going to talk a lot about your tool and some other things, but one of the things I think maybe we start with is some of the background research, but first the vocabulary around advice experience versus client experience. Could you help explain kind of the difference between those and what you mean when you say advice experience?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And by the way, both are important in any value proposition. We can really break a value proposition into those two components. And I like to use analogies from outside of our business to make that really work and understand that. Think about the client experience. It's like walking into a restaurant and having someone, greet you warmly, having a wonderful environment, beautiful table, beautiful surroundings, just a great feel and touch, right? That's the client experience. But then when the food hits the table, the meal in front of you, that's what we'll call the core experience. And in our world, it's the advice experience. And if that core experience is not up to par, let's say the food lands at your table and the steak is burnt, the salad is hot, the wine is bad, then anything you do in the client experience evaporates. It doesn't matter unless you deliver on that core experience. So in our world, that means the advice experience. It means the ultimate outcome, the ultimate result of what we do as financial advisors, helping people, in my favorite phrase is really translate their wealth into a life of meaning and contentment. That's the advice experience. Now, client experience is important. Don't get me wrong. Nice, good, solid engagement, responsiveness, a great latte, nice office, tickets to the ball game, all good. But without the advice experience, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, that actually resonates with me a lot. I was just at a restaurant visiting my kids this weekend, and it was the same experience. It was a great restaurant. It was beautiful. I got my chicken, and it was crazy dry. And I was like, "Oh man, like I could do better at home."
Yeah. Well, and if we can think about what that actually does. So you get the chicken lands, it's dry. The advice experience lands, and it's okay, not bad, not great. What does that do to your loyalty? Are you for that restaurant? You're like, I can't wait to come back, or right? You most likely won't.
Yeah,
Let alone tell someone about it.
Right, you got to get the core pieces right. Like at the end of the day, the other stuff is nice. It's there. It helps, but you have to deliver on that core.
Correct.
All right, cool. All right, I think that's helpful. Advice experience versus client experience, very helpful. Before we get into kind of the other thing is you've had a lot of experience. You worked at JD Power, doing some research around advice experience. What are some of the insights you learned, just kind of along the way in your journey, but also as you were thinking about Practice Intel and some of the components that you would include as part of that tool set? Like, so what is the research? What is the research? What is some of the research you learned?
Well, in just before my role at JD Power as head of Wealth Solutions, the Wealth Solutions practice, with 25 plus years in the broker dealer ecosystems in a variety of roles. So I am a licensed advisor. So I know the space really well, like you do, Jeff. And when we think about the advice experience or how advisors, the value proposition most advisors bring to the table, there's a pretty wide dispersion. There's some great advisors out there, and we know that. One of them, by the way, is a Valmark advisor. He's my advisor. There's a bunch of advisors, like say, that are really hardworking, well-intentioned, do a yeoman's work. And then there's probably some advisors we might not want to engage with very much. And I knew that going into my role at JD Power. And I think most people in our industry would agree with that sort of experiential perspective. So I was able to go into JD Power and then look at a very deep set of research around client response and how clients responded to what I'll call the core advice attributes. So at my previous firm, lots and lots of things got measured, which is great. But the key thing was to extract those things that tended to matter most. And one challenge we have, if you try to work on 120 things at one time, it's very difficult to actually make any progress. So the goal there was to extract those advice attributes that, when delivered, led to a really extraordinary advice experience, super high advocacy, loyalty, all those things. So I was able to do that. I led the team that created this advice experience, and I think in JD Power term, referred to it as the advisory experience continuum, and published extensively on that in Barron's. And that just really backed up what we know experientially with the research and data. Now, the gap was there was all this research, which is great at the industry and even the firm level, but where it didn't exist was at the practice level. And so that's what Practice Intel, one of our core missions, is to bring this research all the way down. I call it institutional consumer research, all the way down to the individual advisor's desktop.
I like it. So you shared, so I think one of the things that people think about is like, okay, well, you mentioned there's a difference, right, between these like different tiers. And I'd say, people say, is it a little bit of a difference? It is a big difference. And then you shared some data with me around some like net promoter scores, and then how that impacts the advisor's ability to attract new clients. And I was shocked by the difference. Do you want to share that?
Yeah, sure. And again, we can, if you look at some of the Barron's articles that I published over the last couple of years, again, this data was published there. So when the client, there were 7 attributes. When the client said yes, emphatically yes, I'm getting those, meaning that restaurant, yes, that chicken was great. When those 7 attributes were delivered, NPS was in the high 80s or low 90s. Right. So net promoter score, advocacy. And as you move into that low 90s, you're pretty much, it's unequivocal for the most part. 92, 93, 94 is almost 100. But as you slid then to an experience where the client is saying yes, or maybe, I think so, then advocacy or NPS dropped into the 60s, in the mid 60s.
Which is still pretty high. Like if you look at like, that's still a pretty high score compared to other industries.
Yeah, and so listen, I don't disagree with that. Now, if we think about the importance of financial advice and the impact financial advice can have, financial advice delivered to its fullest extent can have a profound impact on one's life. And I think we know James Lee at the CFP board often talks about financial advice being the 4th great profession. And if it's the 4th great profession, being okay, like if you got a 65 in college, how was that on your test?
That's not great. I guess the same thing. So I know in like search engine optimization, they use this phrase, your money or your life. And Google like literally categorizes those differently. And they're much more stringent in information that they present that involves either your money or your life. So I guess it makes sense, right? Nobody wants a mediocre doctor or really a mediocre financial advisor, right? Like people want good advice.
Indeed. And if we think about, by the way, when I said, strongly agree, emphatic yes for that ideal, and then that chasm between strongly agree and somewhat agree, that goes from an emphatic yes to, yeah, I think so, or maybe. I mean, that's on the measurement scale, it's just one thing over, but in reality, it's an incredibly large gap. So how was the restaurant? Yeah, it's pretty good. Are you going back? Right. Yeah, maybe. I don't know. If we 6 months from now, when I really forget what the experience was like, and then what happens is 6 months later you go and you're like, why did we go here? Why didn't we just eat at home?
Yeah. So one of the things I really like about what you've developed is it's more than just a single number. You're looking at, multiple attributes, and then you've kind of taken those and you created your own index. Do you want to talk about your RQI or your relationship quality index?
Absolutely. So first of all, I will say I am a big believer in that promoter score. I think when someone says they're going to advocate, that's a really important thing. And just a quick note on that, advocacy is more than just a referral. A referral is saying, yeah, there's a restaurant over there, that's where the steakhouse is. That's referral. Advocacy is, wow, an amazing place. You need to go there. I had this happened. I can't wait to go back. In fact, advocacy is just the external manifestation of an internal belief. So if we think when we advocate for something, we start by advocating to ourselves, right? We believe in it, we use it, we go to it, and then we just feel so strongly we tell someone else. So I believe in NPS. But with that said, there are other metrics that attribute value to the client relationships that are really, really important. So our relationship quality index incorporates 4 other metrics. A couple of them include loyalty, value for fees, trust, and there's one other. And we bring all 5 of those metrics together to create this relationship quality index, which denotes in large part, the higher the number, the more embedded growth you have in your practice, because not only do you have advocates, but they're advocating for a higher value experience, a more profound experience. The lower that number is, the more embedded risk there is, both attrition risk and regulatory risk. Now, we may get to this, but we actually plug that number then into a practice valuation tool. The higher the RQI, the higher the multiple, the lower the RQI, the lower the multiple.
That's really interesting. Maybe talk a little bit more about that, because I don't think people necessarily think about that. They just tend to think of like, oh, here's my assets under management and just put a number on it. But that number can vary based on something like some of these other factors, and like you just said, your RQI score.
Yeah. So I mean, think about the quality of the relationships in your practice, in your book. And as a corollary or directly, the amount of embedded growth you have in your book, right? The higher the RQI, the more advocacy, the more growth. In fact, that is organic growth. And we can get to, there's another point around that we can get to in a moment. But if you're buying a practice or let me rephrase that, when you're selling a practice and you can say to the buyer, the quality of the client relationships in my practice, in my book is very high, and I can prove it. I can quantify it. Now, the reality is it's often the flip side of that. You buy a book and you're like, what happens when that book transitions? If the relationships are really, really strong, the likelihood that the client base will endure that trauma of the book transition is higher, because there's stronger relationships. Now, the flip side is the lower the RQI, relationship quality index, the more likely they will attrit when that book transitions, right? So it just provides another metric, and an important metric, to understand, the value of what you actually have. Not everything's made the same.
Yeah. And there's really maybe not a great way to do that outside of a tool like yours. So someone's trying to do some due diligence, that's a great way to do it.
Yeah. And Jeff, to that point, the practice valuation tool is embedded within the practice intelligence platform. So we call ourselves a growth platform. And I like to follow that up by saying really exclamation point, because it's not just, it's not sort of growth. It is actually helping you understand where you are, helping you get better at what you do, and then actually quantifying, monetizing that.
Yeah. So maybe let's talk about that. So let's say I'm an advisor and I get my RQI number, and it's not great. Like, and we were talking about this, like all progress starts by telling the truth. The RQI is like our truth meter. So if I get it and I see it, like, how should I feel, or what should I start thinking about if my RQI number isn't as high as maybe I'd like it to be?
Yeah. So, well, agreed. Any performance improvement starts with knowing where you are and knowing with certainty. And there's another nice sort of phrase to that, is for people who are already successful, who are in high performance businesses like advisors, creating a catalyst for change is really important. And there's some great research out there that says one of the keys to catalyst is hard data and the consequences of that data. So that's much of what we're talking about. Now, we really actually have two sets of data that's really critical. We have the relationship quality index, which is based on 5 particular metrics that attribute value to the relationship. But we want to go back now to the actual advice attributes, going back to we talked about the advice experience. Now, the scoring you get, the way you measure out on the advice experience in terms of the segments of ideal, average, and poor, is going to be highly correlated with your RQI, of course. But the real performance improvement happens in the advice attributes. So as you're understanding and knowing with certainty what your clients think about your advice experience, you can then focus on those attributes that you might be falling a little short and start improving on those. Another way to look at this is the research mechanism around the advice experience, which is really the core of the value proposition, saying that again, allows an advisor to test the validity, test the effectiveness of their go-to-market strategy. Hey, I think I'm doing well. I hope I'm doing well. I might be doing well, but let me test it through the eyes of the client around those core things.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Like I'll use a simple example. Like understanding fees paid, right? Like as an advisor, you may think that you are very articulate, you've written it down, it's documented, it's in your mind, it's very clear and you're communicating clearly. But unless you actually test it with your clients, I mean, they might say, yeah, I know to your face, but you know, when it's actually given to them a different way, they may say, I really don't understand. And you might need to rethink how you present that information or improve it.
Indeed. And by the way, that particular attribute, going back to the published research from JD Power, something around 40+% of clients say they actually understand the fees they pay. And here's a question to you. How can you attribute value to something that you don't even know what you're paying for it, right? But to add on to that, because I know, right? So it's one thing to know where you are, knowing with certainty, but then we want to help advisors actually improve on those attributes. And that's there's 4 components to practice intelligence: practice insights, the research; practice development, which is the learning content focused just on the advice experience. So we focused on the advice process versus a sales process. It provides a really good framework and basis to think about and enact a process that's more of an advice profession versus a sales profession. So we want to absolutely, we want people to know, survey, research, great. But that's not what Practice Intel is about. Practice Intel is about moving people right on the continuum, right on that advice experience dispersion, and get better at what they do.
There's a lot of different research out there, right? And I think as an advisor, it could almost be overwhelming on where to focus your efforts. And so talk to us about how Practice Intel helps us take the data we get as part of our RQI and the 7 components, and then how that research is different than maybe other general research an advisor might come across.
Yeah. So I think the way I'd approach that is the Practice Intel's ARM model is grounded in extensive consumer research. So often what happens with surveys that advisors send out, they either send out the typical satisfaction advocacy survey, right? Do you like me and will you refer me? Or they are offered a relatively blank template to create their own survey. Right. And so so
they're just guessing, they're guessing on those questions, right? Versus your questions have been specifically validated and correlated to items that matter.
Correct. Yes. And if we look, and I'll get a little wonky here. If we look at classic performance improvements, I think a lot of people have heard of 6 Sigma, right? Which means, I think it means 6 errors out of 1,000,000, if I'm correct. Anyway, the point is, like, really high performance. It always starts with first measuring what's important to measure, determining what you want to measure it, work on improvement, and then measure it again. And the great thing about what we offer, it is a rolling research process we refer to as event-based. You don't send out 200 surveys in a given day. You meet with a client and then you follow that up with a survey. You meet with a client, and so you have constantly tracking how well you're doing. And generally what happens if you have 20 clients that say one particular thing and you have 200 clients in total, there's a decent chance the like clients will say similar things. So you're able to track where you are and then the impact of both external and internal changes.
I think what you said is pretty profound. And I just want to dial into that for just a second, because I think people might miss what you did. I think a lot of people, maybe when they're surveying, they'll just survey their whole client base all at once, right? And the time between when they received an experience with you and when they had that survey is going to vary a lot. So you're going to be, when you're delivering your request for feedback, it happens right after an important moment, right? Either we just met or we made a change to your account or something like that. So it's consistent, right? It's measuring around the same time I had a recent interaction with you. And I think people are going to have a better memory on that recent interaction versus maybe 9 months go by and they haven't interacted with you. It might not be as helpful. I mean, I'm in a different business, right? I do more like help desk feedback, but we certainly see that, in ours is when we do more immediate feedback versus just general that somebody has. So I think that's really important. And I think that's something maybe not a lot of other people are doing is getting their feedback in a timely method.
Sure. And there's you kind of got to one of the key points is that that time gap. And by another part of that is if surveys go out at the end of the year, you have seasonal effect too. Everybody's happy around holidays. But the other part about that is it enables you, again, to track. And that's really important. And to track without concern of survey fatigue. So I could track us, right, how we're doing, and send 4 or 5 surveys in a given year, but you will quickly get fatigued on taking those surveys.
Yeah.
And then the other thing is it allows you in that tracking and trending to discern, particularly not just internal changes, which are really important, but also external events as well. Like when the market is really bad, how do they respond? The market's up, world events, etc. So when we think about institutional consumer research, it goes far beyond surveying. And if you notice, I really rarely use the word survey.
Yes. And
because survey is just the tool, the thing that goes out. It's research that we're doing to garner really important insights that can inform action, all towards delivering a better experience, driving more organic growth, really affecting the entire value chain in our industry, the client, the advisor, and the broker-dealer, right? Because all ships rise in rising tide.
All right, Tom. So one of the other things that comes up in our industry is this whole idea of next gen. What do you think about next gen and practice intel?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And there's 2 ways to look at that. Obviously, the next gen client and the next gen advisor. And just starting with the next gen client, reality is no matter what age you are, whether you're a baby boomer or Gen X, Gen Z, Gen Y, whatever the next ones are, everybody wants a good advice experience. Everybody wants their chicken come to the table moist, right? They want their steak cooked well. So, and that research showed that, and there's one of the articles I wrote in Barron's talked about next gen and how they want that experience just as much, and how the advice experience degraded the younger the generation got. So that's the first thing. It doesn't. The truth is the truth. The fundamentals are the fundamentals.
So younger people aren't getting as good advice as they could.
Yeah, and they're not getting the advice experience they could. Now, many might say, well, they don't have much money. We're not paying that much attention to them, and that could be part of that as well. But nonetheless, it's a fact. But then the second part revolves around the next gen advisor. And we all know about the importance of bringing that next generation up. And by the way, one of my partners, my co-founder and my chief evangelist, Dr. Preston Cherry, is actually also heads the financial planning department at the University of Wisconsin, Green Bay. Just saw a post from him this morning. I commented on it on LinkedIn with a group of students at an FPA conference. And I was like, great, you're taking the charge and leading the next generation, which is so critical. But you'll also hear a lot of people say that it takes 5, 6, 7, 8 years to actually get that next gen ready to go in a client-facing, kind of founder role, if I may, right? That business generation role. And I'm going to suggest that what we teach and the education we provide can actually expedite that pretty rapidly. Because what we're providing is the framework to deliver great advice and the client engagement model to deliver great advice. So we believe we can accelerate that learning curve really pretty dramatically for the next generation advisor, which I think would be very important.
All right, Tom, 2 more questions. Next question. What do you hope for the future of our industry with practice intel?
Well, I think as I've always believed, and for the last 20 plus years, is we should be an industry of advice professionals, not just sales professionals. And don't get me wrong, selling is really critical. It's a core component, a core competency of any great business. But what clients need is advice, and we need to field more advice professionals. And we believe, and it's really why we exist, is to help create more advice professionals. And if we think about it, it's kind of a cool ripple effect. So let's say we're able to impact 10% of the advisory population, helping them move right on that dispersion, become better advisors. I'm going to do rough math here. Let's say that 10% roughly is 30,000 advisors. How many clients do they touch? Well, the average I read was 187, so let's say 200. 30,000 times 200 is 6 million clients. Now, extend that to their families, to their legacies, to their communities, right? What we can do and what is possible is nothing short of transformational. And I don't use that word lightly because that's a word that gets thrown around, but this changes lives. And I think that's what we have the opportunity to do.
I love those stats. I think often, especially working in maybe the back office of our industry, sometimes just focused on maybe specifically advisors, but I think it's always so important to think about the number of lives they touch and their clients and their clients' community. And as an industry, I think we just have a huge both responsibility and just opportunity to just really impact those around us. So that's awesome. All right, last question. If somebody wants to learn more about Practice Intel, what's the best way for them to educate and learn more about Practice Intel?
Well, they can start by going to pracintel.com, our website. You'll see all about Practice Intel in terms of what our product offering is, our platform. You'll see a lot of screenshots. You'll have an opportunity to request a demo. We absolutely encourage you to click on that and request a demo. You'll learn about the team at Practice Intel. More about the client experience versus the advice experience, just all sorts of information. So that's where I suggest they go. And we look forward to hearing from lots and lots of advisors.
Awesome. Tom, thank you for speaking with us today.
Hey, Jeff, I really appreciate the opportunity. You have a good rest of the day.
All right, take care.